So you guys all had sort of a lot to look over for this class period. You've looked at some adaptation actions that people have taken at different scales, both on that EPA website and then also on the Georgetown Climate Change Center website. So you have some idea of adaptation actions that people are taking. And then I also had you guys look at the one paper about the ADGER paper that was looking at cross-scale linkages. And then I also had various different groups look at different types of adaptation actions happening at different scales. So today our focus is really on scale and how scale influences adaptation. And last week we talked a lot about vulnerability. And vulnerability is important to understand with adaptation because vulnerability lets you know kind of where the most need is. And so when you don't have a lot of money, when you don't have a lot of resources to do adaptation strategies, you really want to target those where they're going to be most useful. So we talked about vulnerability last week, and this week I really want to talk about interactions between scales. So how actions at one scale could constrain or help actions at another scale. So that's kind of what we'll be focusing on. And so we talked about this, but I didn't actually put up an actual definition, so I wanted to put this up just so that you all had a good definition. This is what the IPCC defines adaptation as, an adjustment in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to observed or expected changes in climate stimuli and their effects and impacts in order to alleviate adverse impacts of change or take advantage of new opportunities. So big mouthful, but basically what we do proactively or reactively to adjust to changes that we're seeing, climate stimuli changes. So that in itself is like, it's wordy, but it's pretty direct. It's what we do in response to changes that we see. But it's also this, and this is kind of what I want to get across to you, is it's not so simple. It's really kind of this continuous ongoing process that happens at all different scales by all different types of actors. It's activities, actions, decisions, and attitudes that inform decisions about all aspects of life and that reflect the existing norms and social processes. So it's embedded in everything else that's happening in the world. And so when you think about climate change adaptation, you really should think about it as embedded in the whole context of whatever community or system it's happening to. So for instance, you don't do climate change adaptation without thinking about the economic drivers in a local community or without thinking about the other stressors, maybe demographic change, whatever it might be. But these things are all interconnected and happening at a lot of different scales. So this diagram kind of shows you the major questions that you have to ask when you're looking at different types of adaptation. So the box is, what is adaptation? And you're looking at adaptation to what? Who's adapting? So adaptation by whom? And then how does adaptation occur? And so these are kind of the three major questions that you'd be asking if you're thinking about adaptation. And as you can see, there's those non-climate forces and conditions that you also have to bring into account. Those are also going to affect it. And then we are going to be focusing a lot this morning on this evaluation piece. So how good is that adaptation and how do we gauge how good it is? And so you can have adaptation occurring, but you really need to start thinking about how do we know if this is, what are the criteria, what are the principles, how do we know if this is effective or not? All right. So in general, people have split adaptation actions into two different forms. They've said you can be reactive to climate change impacts. So for instance, there's a drought and cattle start dying and a rancher decides, wow, I probably should sell off some of the cattle. That's reactive. That's something happened to you and now you're reacting to it. In some circles, they say that this is often more of a private way of going about adaptation. So private stakeholders react to what they see on the ground. Then there's anticipatory, and this is really thinking ahead of time, thinking proactively about what might happen in the future. So this is in anticipation, and things like planting drought tolerant crops. This example is a very private example. So like if there's a farmer and you realize that you've seen this trend in climate variables over time and you begin to plant more drought tolerant crops, that would be a proactive thing that you're doing in response to climate change. But oftentimes anticipatory actions are public. So it's something that the state government does or the local government does, or a group of citizens come together and say, hey, we need to start thinking about how these changes are going to impact us. So those are the two major types, but I would say that they're really not quite that well delineated and defined. When you think about actual adaptation actions, they're often a mix of the two. So for instance, I'm working on a project in hydropower in Alaska, and basically what they're asking is, we've seen all these massive melt-off events where we get tons of water coming through, we lose it, it flows over instead of generating energy. And we're now thinking about, do we build bigger hydropower storage facilities so that we can capture this water as it runs down? Well, it's reactive in the sense that they've lost water before, and that's money, and so they're thinking about making them bigger, but it's proactive in the sense that they're thinking about the future as well. So I just want to bring up the fact that even though this is how it's defined in the literature and how people talk about it, either reactive or proactive, they're actually really interacting, and often not that easy to say, well, this is reactive and this is proactive, because they interact. And as we talked about last week, to adapt, so when you're thinking about adaptation strategies, you can do a few things. You can reduce exposure, you can reduce sensitivity, or you can increase adaptive capacity. And here, the polar bear has gotten a lot of additional adaptive capacity and is still going to get those penguins. But I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So to reduce exposure, like we talked about last week, climate change mitigation is a big thing. If you mitigate, you reduce the amount of exposure that you're going to face in the future. And so these are integrally linked. You can also do things like hazard prevention. So you can be exposed to massive forest fires because you live in an area that has had bark beetle kill and has gone through a drought. And you're exposed. You have high exposure because of climate variables that have led to this situation. But hazard prevention, like thinning efforts to decrease the fuel load of a forest, is a type of reducing exposure. So that's one way. So as one adaptation strategy you might think of, okay, well, let's reduce the exposure here. Let's do some hazard mitigation, and then people will not be as prone to massive fires in their community. You can also reduce sensitivity. So there's many ways to reduce sensitivity. One way is if you're thinking about a community like Gunnison, for instance, that a lot of the businesses, a lot of the livelihoods depend on water that flows through the system. Well, if you're seeing that you're not getting the same flows that you always have, and they're not coming at the same time, you can increase reservoir capacity at the top of that watershed, and that would reduce your sensitivity, because then you can regulate more fully when water is going through that system. Planting hardier plants, that's another way of reducing your sensitivity. Maybe those plants were more sensitive to certain conditions, and if you can get new varieties, they're going to be less sensitive. You can also work on places that you know are sensitive. So for instance, if you have a flood-prone area, you might think about developing infrastructure that's going to be able to withstand those floods. And so that would be a way of reducing sensitivity. And then building adaptive capacity is like one of these catch-alls. And I find that oftentimes this is where a lot of adaptation strategy efforts are focused. It's really about getting people to think. It's about social learning. It's about getting people to think what the future might look like and start to adapt to that. It's also about maintaining your well-being and your resources. So making sure that the system that you're working on is healthy, making sure that the resources that you have are conserved, and then exploiting new opportunities. So in a lot of ways, we often think very negatively about climate change, which is because there are lots of unforeseen things that could happen, and they all interact, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there will definitely be a lot of negative repercussions from climate change. But in the same point, if you're a business owner, if you have a livelihood that's based on climate conditions, things might get a little easier for you depending on what your business is and, you know, what you're worried about. So for instance, you know, when I did interviews in the Gunnison Basin about climate change and told people, you might see 2 degrees of warming, that's what they're projecting. A lot of people in the community, especially recreation-based businesses, said, woohoo! Not ski-based businesses, but a lot of them said, it's freaking cold and it's hard to get people here. Our season's really narrow because it's really cold. And so to exploit new opportunities, to think proactively about both what could happen that's negative and what could happen that's positive is a way of building adaptive capacity. And then the thing that we're going to focus on the most today and the activity that we're going to have that will help you kind of interact with us is this idea of scale. And primarily spatial scale, but also organizational and governance-wise. There's a whole different level of scales from the household to the local, to the regional, to the national, to the international, on which adaptation is happening. So you have to think about adaptation not as something that happens solely in a top-down manner or solely at one level of organizations or governance, but it's happening at all of these levels. And we really have to learn how to do this better because often we just don't think across these scales. You know, we don't have to coordinate in a really strategic way across these scales very often. And so there's spatial scale. There's also sort of thinking about really short-term adaptations. Oftentimes these are the reactive ones, or very long-term, like thinking about, you know, the distant future and how we're going to adapt to things that are going to be, you know, 50 years from now. And when you think about adaptation, you have to think about both, because when you're making decisions, let's say you're, you know, building roads, and roads are something that are around for 100, 150 years. Well, if you're building roads and not thinking about the long-term implications of climate change, you might be building them in places that, you know, are going to be flooded in the future, or you know, have some kind of other impact. And so as examples, a very household level short term, it's really hot, so you buy an air conditioner. It solves your problem for the time being. It's a very short term adaptation strategy. If you think of a national and long term adaptation strategy, well, there's a lot of dialogue happening right now about what should the mission of the National Park Service be? How do we manage these resources? How do we manage these things that people value in a changing climate? And so those are just 2 examples kind of along this continuum. And in the Adger paper, he kind of ends with this statement. The success or sustainability of adaptation actions has to be determined differently at different scales. And so that was kind of his whole premise and ending of his argument, is that we can't think about these the same way across scales. Not everyone is going to think that an adaptation strategy is effective because they're looking at it from an entirely different place, and maybe it's impacting them differently. And so when we think about success, it's not just about whether it meets the objective. So if your objective with an adaptation strategy is get people to have more efficient houses, or get people to build outside of fire-prone areas, or whatever it is, that's your objective. You can measure that and see, did we accomplish it, did we not? But if you really want to care, if you really care about the long-term success or effectiveness of an action, you really have to think about externalities, because what you do in one place at one scale could have implications for other places at other scales. And so it may have unintended consequences that you're just not thinking of at the time. You know, in the paper they talk about that the short-term benefit of buying an air conditioner, well, yes, you're cooler and you can deal with that heat wave a little bit better. But long-term, it's actually creating more emissions, it's taking up more energy. And so long-term, that's not really a great adaptation strategy. So to try to think about this across, you know, both spatial and temporal scales. And so there were 4 ways that Adger said, these are the ways that we can manage the effectiveness or the success of adaptation actions. And it's effectiveness, efficiency, legitimacy, and equity. So those are the 4 things that he talked about. And with effectiveness, effectiveness really is that, are you meeting your objectives? So it is the very basic, what did you set out to do, and did you meet that objective? That's not the only thing that we should look at, but it is important. I mean, you want whatever you do to meet the objectives that you have. So how do you measure that? Well, you measure, did it reduce the impacts that you were concerned about? And as we all know now, there's 3 ways to do that. You reduce the exposure, you reduce the sensitivity, or you increase adaptive capacity. And so you would look at, all right, how did we do it? Did we reduce exposure? Did we reduce sensitivity? Or did we increase adaptive capacity? And did it actually reduce the impact? And you could look at things like projected areas that would be, you know, negatively impacted by drought, and then whatever you did it change the areas that were affected by drought, and if so, how? So you measure the actual impact that you've reduced. But effectiveness is really hard, and this is part of the reason why you have to look at all 4 of those criteria instead of just effectiveness, because to know if something's effective, that's often really hard to know ahead of time, because you're making choices based on what you think the future will be like. And even though we know that climate change is happening and we know that the trends are going in that direction, we don't know the very specifics of how it will manifest in specific places. And so your effectiveness really depends on what that future world looks like. So you could design an incredibly effective adaptation strategy for the world that you think is going to exist, and that world may never come. And so you have to be really careful, because looking at effectiveness really depends on whether your predictions about the future are correct. Also, your actions often depend on the actions of other people. So you can design a wonderful adaptation strategy, but if the people that you propose are going to adopt that strategy don't do it, it probably won't be effective. And then that unintended consequences that we talked about before. And so the kind of take-home message that people talk about with adaptation strategies is that you want to think about robust strategies. And a robust strategy is a strategy that's going to be effective regardless of exactly what happens on the ground in the future. So if you think about like model projections and you have a range, it's going to be somewhere between here. Well, a robust strategy is going to be able to work with that range of strategies. So regardless of what the actual future is, it's going to work regardless. And so in a lot of fields, they call this no regrets actions. So regardless of what the future is, these will be robust. You will not regret them, because even if the change doesn't happen exactly the way you think it will be, it will still be helpful. And then also flexible in the sense that it doesn't commit you forever to one action, that you can change over time. And oftentimes people think about this as, sunk costs. So if your adaptation action is something that that costs a lot of money, creates a lot of new infrastructure that's around for a long time, you've sunk a lot of cost into that. It's not very it's not very flexible, because if the future doesn't turn out the way that you think it will be, it's not going to work. But if it's a flexible adaptation action, it's something that can change and change over time. So the other thing is efficiency, which is really about how much does it cost us and what are the benefits that we get. That's the second way that we kind of gauge whether something's successful. And it's really critical to understand too, not just the costs and the benefits, but who carries them. Because distribution is going to be a huge issue with climate change. Who carries the cost, who has the burden of it, and who gets the benefits of those adaptation actions. And so you really want to think about costs and benefits, but you also want to think about how that's distributed amongst the population. And not just about things that we can quantify, but what about cultural things? Like, what about your culture? What about social cohesion? What about community connection? And these things become really important when we start talking about climate refugees. So if you think about the community that I told you about last week, Newtok, and they're trying to move their entire community from a place that they have been for millennia to another place. Now, there's costs involved for sure. I mean, it's really expensive to develop all that new infrastructure, but think about the non-monetary costs that are involved. You know, they have a whole system of their subsistence livelihood, where they go to hunt, where they go to fish, you know, where they go for different spiritual activities. All of that will be kind of disassembled when they move to a new location. So you've really got to think about the costs that we can't monetize. Then we also have to think about the timing of the costs and actions. Oftentimes, when you adopt an adaptation strategy, the cost of how much it will actually, good morning, has to do with when you adopt that strategy. So you want to think about the timing of actions. And then equity and legitimacy are huge, because you're not going to be successful. Your adaptation strategy is never going to be adopted if you don't get the buy-in of a large group of people. And it's not just buy-in, it's making sure that those costs that we talked about are spread equally across the population. So thinking about things like, in terms of the outcomes from this adaptation action, who's going to benefit, who's going to lose from it, and who deserves to win and lose? You know, when you're thinking about who created the problem and who's bearing the weight of the burden, how do we make those decisions? Who has the most need? And when we think about equality, how are these adaptation strategies either increasing inequality or decreasing inequality? And then legitimacy is really about who makes the decisions, who gets to make the call on what is done, and how does that happen? And if a decision is seen as legitimate or not, often determines how much support that decision gets. So if you need to do adaptation strategies that have wide support, you really need to make sure that the way that you do that is seen as legitimate by a large group of people, hopefully the whole population. And these lessons come from that Adger paper that you guys read. And the first lesson is that adaptation strategies can also often amplify current conflicts. So just because you're doing an adaptation strategy does not mean that at all that it's not political. Oftentimes the power struggles that already exist will be amplified by this, because the people who are making the decisions about what the adaptation actions are often not the people that are in power. And so those people are thinking, well, what's best for us? And if more resources are put into protecting the people that already have the power, then it can amplify these conflicts. So it's something to keep in mind. And oftentimes people think, well, adaptation really just occurs via impacts. So you look at what's going to be impacted, and those groups are going to be adapting more. But it's really this complex political thinking about costs and benefits. And so adaptation actions are definitely not just a natural phenomenon that happens. It's really about this process of thinking about costs and benefits. And then, of course, adaptation across scales really adds to all of this complexity, because there's different processes and there's different values at different scales. And some scales or decision-making structures may have more power than others and are able to kind of do top-down measures that might impact other scales negatively. So those are kind of the main three take-homes. And so last week we didn't really get to talk about this, but I wanted to have some time to talk about it today. So last week you guys came in looking at a region or a sector and some kind of adaptation action that they had done at that region or sector. And so I wanted to find out, you know, what did you find? What type of action was it? Now that you kind of are thinking about these issues of effectiveness, efficiency, and equitability, how do you think that it ranks that way? And do you have any concerns about how that adaptation that you looked at could have cross-scale impacts? So anyone want to share an action that you found?
I looked at coastal adaptations. The EPA website mentioned that 23 of the 25 most densely populated U.S. cities are in coastal areas, which I thought was a pretty striking stat. And so they kind of went over the impacts, which have to do with, you know, just, I think things that we could normally expect, like larger storm surges because of, you know, already a 7-inch rise in sea levels during the 20th century. But also impacts like salinity, like saltwater intrusion to groundwater aquifers, where you have freshwater, groundwater right near the coast. As the sea level rises, it just sort of salinates the water. And they also talked about how drought, like inlands, can reduce freshwater runoff, and that also affects salinity and like up river systems and estuaries, and that can affect fisheries and aquatic habitat and diversity. Then some adaptations. There's a couple different ways to go about it. There are kind of like restoring natural buffers, so looking at salt marshes and wetlands and dune habitat as a way to kind of slow some of that down and slow down erosion. Also like mangroves and coral reefs, either restoring that or creating policies to just protect those and slow down degradation and that sort of approach, but also upgrading building codes to kind of cope with storm surges. So thinking about what policies can we amend in like the engineering of buildings, so in the future when new construction happens, you know, we think about it in terms of thinking about what sort of sea level rise we want to be ready for, like 3-foot sea level rise. Like how long is this building going to last? And then maybe the building's going to last for like 75 years. So you use your best available science to think about maybe what's like the high end that we want to prepare for. And then thinking other policies, thinking about like where construction is allowed, like making efforts to like map out erosion zones a little bit better, think about setbacks from erosion areas, and then just be more mindful of those natural buffers. Another big one was developing emergency response plans to think about, like, so when sea level is getting higher and you get one of those major storms like Superstorm Sandy in a really densely populated area, what is your comprehensive response for that, for like human health?
Right. Yeah. So, do you think? I was thinking about the coastal erosion one and zoning and changing zoning to, and I was thinking, wow, well, that could have some impacts in terms of equitability. Based on who owns that land now and how much value is taken away by a zoning change.
Yeah.
And,
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's that. I would say it's definitely also like a blended reactive and anticipatory action. But yeah, I mean, my aunt and uncle live in a coastal area, and talking to Rose talk last week, like their insurance rates for certain things are like skyrocketing now because they live like really close to the coast in close to New York City, and since Sandy, they've just been dealing with like strongly increasing insurance rates with that. But I don't know. In talking about equity. In an area like that, it's pretty wealthy people that live on the coast.
and
So it
probably
seems
in
like
the
they're,
U.S.
a little more able to deal with it. But yeah, when you start thinking about developing countries where there are enormous amounts of people, and I think it's a little different.
Anyone else have a strategy? You've all looked at one.
Well, I looked at the Colorado report, and I thought it was interesting, but I didn't really think of like the strategy of being like create a plan, but that was what they were considering adaptation strategies. Like they had like taken that about half of what their goals were, and a lot of them were more just like space in terms of preparing the government to kind of even talk about it. Like, so I thought
Yeah.
that was interesting. There's like this pre-planning stage of like a lot of people are not even in a place where the government structures are there to discuss and adaptation and remediation efforts to climate change.
Yeah.
So I was kind of surprised that like still today in 2015 we're still dealing with some of these like really pre-planning stages, making sure there's a committee in place that can handle things. And then I also thought it was interesting that the Colorado water plan, since we've all been talking about it a lot, actually kind of came out of this 2007 climate readiness report for Colorado. And so
Yeah.
I realized that, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, that's really, and I think that it's a really critical point to make. I think that in a lot of ways where we are with adaptation right now is just what you're talking about, like getting the structures in place, building people's awareness of things, and not necessarily like going out and doing something, even though that doing is happening, it's less common.
I feel like I'm going to try not to have any overlap with John because I looked at the U.S. islands, and interestingly enough, the islands all face problems with their freshwater supply. Pacific Islands are expected to have an increase in precipitation, and then the Caribbean Islands are expected to have a decrease. And as far as the increase in precipitation goes, that increases the chance of sewage to mix with the raw freshwater and also salt water to mix with the freshwater. And in the Caribbean, there's less precipitation and there's less groundwater. But one thing I thought was kind of interesting, which is not directly related to the water, is in Puerto Rico, the NOAA is working with the university there in the for the Sea Grant Puerto Rico program. They have adaptation demonstrations all over the islands, their islands, but then they also host conferences for all the Caribbean islands to educate about climate change, which is kind of equitable because they're reaching out to the other communities, the non-US islands. However, even if the conferences are free, they expect them to be able to get there, and that might not be realistic for a lot of the community, the people in the community there. So it's kind of a cool resource.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm sure they're not reaching as many people as they'd like.
Yeah. But it is kind of a cool resource, and it's a way to think about taking expertise from one place and sharing it with a lot of others, and building that social learning and adaptive capacity. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
I looked at places that have are trying to adapt to both water shortages and flooding. Places like Chicago, I guess, are going to have both droughts and floods. The way they're doing that is through this rain barrel program, which they say is going to mitigate the effects of flooding. I don't really understand how something like a rain barrel can keep a city from flooding.
Are they just like the regular like household rain barrels?
They're huge,
Oh, okay.
but I mean they're still not that big.
Yeah.
But I guess they give people a rebate. You get one, get a rebate, and you get to use all the water that collects off your roof.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. I guess on a large scale, or if they had enough of them, or something.
Yeah, if everyone adopted it, maybe. That's the thing with effectiveness, like they're dependent on people adopting it, and
But it would have to be on a large scale. And it's interesting that I guess one of the biggest challenges with like xeriscaping and all those things is like people need to have water to use right away.
Yeah.
Like they have to have access to water always, and so the idea of these rain barrels is that you have access to water as soon as it rains.
It's there.
And you don't have to wait or use the aquifer or
Yeah.
it's sort of like people are in charge of their own water.
Yeah. And if they have enough.
Visible.
Yeah. Neat. Anyone else?
Another interesting piece about like coastal, and I went to Alaska as well, was thinking about decreasing sea ice, and thinking about like now like the ocean is opening up, and so the Navy is really thinking about climate change adaptation, and not, more in the sense that like this is like going to happen. We need to figure out a plan of like how to, I don't know, have a presence in the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah. Yep, it becomes a place of commerce and trade, and they're looking at shipping routes. Yeah. Yeah. But really interesting, yeah. The needs that it creates, because it's a new area that probably should be patrolled and
Right.
yeah. Cool. One more person? Come on, did anyone do a, like, more of a localized adaptation strategy, something at like the city scale?
A little bit, I guess.
Well,
It's kind of coastal again. I have an uncle that live in Ocean Shores, Washington, which is like a little peninsula. And after the earthquakes and tsunamis that hit Japan, they kind of started looking at different regions along the U.S. coast that would be, you know, came this way
Yeah.
here. And Ocean Shores is like gone. They have one road out of town, and it takes probably half an hour to an hour. You know, everybody's leaving too. It's just
Yeah.
to totally clutter that up. So there's not really any way to fix that. So all they can really do is just try to augment their early warning system.
Yeah.
And hope to alert people faster.
Ahead of time so that they can, they're not looking at any sort of, is there any kind of shoreline protection that they can do? Or?
I think it's like just a flat island. It's hardly even above
Gotcha.
sea level, so
Yeah, there's nothing you can do.
Other than, you know, not live there, which people aren't gonna do.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the hard thing with climate change adaptation. Some of the options of how to adapt are very unpalatable, like, well, you can move. You know, it's not necessarily like what people want to hear. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about final group projects, and this is what I pulled this morning from the discussion board, so it should be pretty current. The ones that are bolded are pretty definite groups. I think we have like 3 to 5 people in each of those. Some people are in 2 groups, like Barry here. So you'll just have to decide, Barry, which group you prefer to be in, either the snowpack or the butterfly migrations. So our constraint that we have is that we can only do 9 presentations. So we've got 6 that are kind of set right now, and we can only do 9. Does everyone see their name up there? Is anyone not up there? Trent, did you say what you would like to be in?
I said I would like to be in Forest Health.
Okay, all right. So you'd like to be in Forest Health?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is, if you're in one of these groups that has 1 or maybe 2 people, could you talk to the other people that are like, Chloe and Chelsea should talk to Sarah, none of them are here right now. But if Diego, Ross, and Sarah in this group could get together, we just need to have 3 in each is what we're hoping for. So the people that are in a set group, you're set. If you are not in a set group and there's another group here that you'd like to be a part of, we'd like to keep every group to 5. So don't join a group that already has 5, but if there's a group that you would like to be a part of, email me to let me know what you're thinking, and we'll finalize these. But it would be really good. When you think about it, you have 2 weeks until spring break, and then the presentations are going to be after spring break. And so you really want to start working with your group and thinking about your issue, looking into what's been done locally or what's been done elsewhere, doing your interviews, and then putting together your presentation. So don't wait until the last minute for this. I think a lot of people will be out of town for spring break, so get started. If you're confused about groups, let me know, and we'll try to finalize these, and then I'll post the final list on Blackboard so everyone knows what they're doing and where they are. I think that we're going to take like a 10-minute break. I'm not sure what time it is, but I have an activity. Before we take a 10-minute break, I'll just tell you a little bit about the activity. So each of you guys were, based on your first name, were either a national, state, or a local group. So we're going to split into those groups, and I'm going to give you kind of a scenario of some kind of climate change impact event that's happened. And then I'm going to ask each of you to think about 2 adaptation strategies that you would propose based on who you are in that scenario. And then this way we'll get back together later and talk about kind of the adaptation strategies that each group at each different level came up with and the interactions between those. So it should be fun, but I've never done it before with people, so we'll do our best. But let's take 10 minutes and then we'll come back and regroup, and I'll give you more information about that, and then we'll go out. Yeah.
As far as the project presentation, you know, like what days we're gonna
Oh, that is actually, maybe when we get back together, we'll figure that out first. That's a good question.
Oh,
Early?
It's a little too early to talk. I've actually been on that so I need
Oh, yeah, they're right there. You can just grab them. Yeah.